If you've been following some of Symposia's recent coverage of Mark Hayden's departure as Executive Director of MAPS Canada and his association with Dr. Martin Ball, you likely won't need much background for the following discussion. However, if you're unfamiliar with these people and events, check out the links in the show notes to get up to speed. To summarize, Dr. Ball has publicly discussed vomiting on clients, touching their genitals, sitting on their chests and yelling at them, and failing to offer proper medical treatment while both he and his clients were under the influence of 5-MeO-DMT. Symposia put together a video that featured Dr. Ball's statements on these issues, as we found them to be dangerous. While Dr. Ball's actions were widely condemned on social media, many psychedelic practitioners and enthusiasts found greater fault with Symposia's video than with Dr. Ball's own admissions. In the public discussion following our reporting, many of Dr. Ball's supporters demonstrated a clear disregard for basic concepts of safety and consent. Here's why we're concerned with Dr. Ball. He edited, published, and wrote the foreword to the Manual for Psychedelic Guides, a book by MAPS Canada's outgoing Executive Director, Mark Hayden. This presents a public impression that he is a legitimate authority with actionable guidance for practicing as a guide. But remember, in Ball's writing on how to become a non-dual practitioner, he says that clients appreciate being vomited on. I don't know about you, but this isn't an approach I want taught to future guides. Presenting Dr. Ball as an authority in psychedelic therapy highlights an ongoing credibility problem for MAPS and MAPS Canada. They legitimize Dr. Ball's practices and implicitly encourage others to follow his lead. So here's why we're sharing this document with you. Symposia was sent the following document by Dr. Martin Ball, and he requested that we not share it. In an email, Dr. Ball told Symposia that this document was not for public dissemination or public discussion. Symposia never agreed to those terms. After an ethical consultation, we believed that sharing this document is in the public interest because Dr. Ball has used it to justify his actions and practices with clients, and in his public attempts to discredit Symposia's reporting. Dr. Ball claims that he provided a document to potential clients describing his methods and as a way for them to consent to his techniques. Symposia has confirmed with one client who has come forward but asked to remain anonymous that this document was never supplied to them prior to a session with Ball. In public appearances, Dr. Ball has claimed that consent is important to him. However, this is not actually a consent document. Ball refers to this document as what sets the stage for clients to understand and agree to his practices. The existence of this sheet and the conversations Ball has with clients form the basis of his supporters' claims that those who undergo his sessions have fully consented to whatever occurs within the context of the session. The word consent does not appear anywhere in this document, and it does not have any signature lines or explicit agreements. Additionally, one cannot consent under the influence of mind-altering drugs. The document omits numerous health and safety risks that Dr. Ball has openly acknowledged in public forums that may occur after the ingestion of 5-MeO-DMT, including stopping breathing, potential for lingering psychological effects, psychosis, and death. Nowhere in the document does Dr. Ball disclose that he has no medical training, nor medical professionals present. The document also fails to disclose that Dr. Ball might vomit on clients or touch their genitals. We believe that this document provides a good example of grooming tactics. It sets the stage for what is considered normal and positions Dr. Ball as the authority on the subject. It creates expectations which render people more vulnerable, and it filters out those who are less susceptible to manipulation tactics and who notice the red flags early on. According to Dr. Ball's Entheogenic Paradigm website, which is described as humanity's guide to reality, Dr. Ball explicitly rejects moral and ethical systems and states that they are incompatible with his worldview. Dr. Ball's supporters have pointed to the fact that he is a professional who has published on his methodology to legitimize his techniques. To be clear, Dr. Ball has no professional, therapeutic, or medical training. And just because someone has published on something doesn't mean it's legitimate or good practice. Let's consider the example of Larry Nassar, the former USA Gymnastics national team doctor and convicted serial rapist. Nassar published and presented his techniques to law enforcement as they were investigating him. The fact that law enforcement accepted Nassar's published techniques as legitimate practices allows Nassar to continue harming young women for years. Confident claims of authority are sometimes used as a smokescreen to mask unethical and abusive behavior. As we read through this document, we'd like you to keep in mind some of the barriers clients might face in trying to exert agency during Dr. Ball's non-dual energetic therapy while under the influence of 5-MeO-DMT.
Guardamos. Excelente. Guardamos. Aire adentro por la boca. Aguantamos. 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 Aire adentro. Comparado, equilibrio, con balance. Arriba, respirando. 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 Respira. Respira. Desempiézate, desempiézate.
In these videos of Octavio Rettig, you can see just how little agency a person is able to exercise under the influence of 5-MeO-DMT. On one episode of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast, Dr. Ball discusses various issues of abuse surrounding Octavio Rettig's practices. He states that if at any point a client wants to end a session, well then, that's the end of the session. But you've seen the Rettig video. Do you think that's possible? So let's get into our discussion. Hey y'all, I'm Dr. Lily K. Ross. I've got a PhD in gender studies looking at social responses to sexual violence and community silencing tactics, and a master's of divinity from Harvard.
I'm Russell Hosfeld. I write for Symposia, and I participated in the recent reporting that we released on Martin Ball and Mark Hayden of MAPS Canada.
I'm Dr. Nishay Devano. I recently completed a postdoc in bioethics and medical ethics from Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine.
And I'm David Nichols, and I also contributed to the recent reporting on Martin Ball and Mark Hayden up at MAPS Canada. I'm the managing editor of Symposia. So with that said, I think we're going to dive into a little bit of a rundown of this document that Dr. Ball sent us. Is there anything anyone wants to say before we jump in? All right.
Let's get to
Ready.
Sorry, I'm share screen. So this is the document that Dr. Ball sent Russell, titled Energetic Openings Session Info Sheet. You are receiving this as you have expressed interest in visiting me for the purposes of having a session. This sheet is intended to give you some basic information to assist you in making your plans and preparing mentally. If you have additional questions, you may email me directly. Introduction. We will be working with an extremely powerful tryptamine neurotransmitter that produces radical and near instantaneous transformations in perception, consciousness, and physical embodied experience. While this medicine is magical, it is not a magic bullet. It is important to always keep in mind that free will and conscious choice are never violated by any medicine, no matter how powerful. What this means is that you will get out of this what you are willing to allow yourself to experience. No one can choose to trust, surrender, and let go for you. Only you can make these choices within yourself.
So should we stop there and go over those first lines?
So cutting in there, like, the word power is mentioned 6 times in this document. And I think that that's worth pointing out. There's a lot of comments here that seem grandiose and self-aggrandizing and sort of egotistical, speaking to the power of the drug and the power of the methodology that he's using, which I just think is worth flagging out the gate.
It's also worth just to throw out there, when you're talking about the power of the drug or the power of the medicine, Alicia Danforth talks about that a bit in Coming Down from the Psychedelic Power Trip, and I think offers some really good dissections of the hows and whys of people sort of revering the power of these experiences and the dynamics therein. Sorry.
And also, if I could add about the comment that free will is never violated by any medicine is a really striking and confusing claim to make. And it doesn't actually, it flies in the face of both consensus and legal understandings about consent, since it's impossible to give or withdraw consent while incapacitated. And the logic that he's using here implies that someone who is, or could imply, depending on how you interpret the word medicine, imply that someone who is blackout drunk never fully loses their agency. And then if they're assaulted while drunk, they somehow chose the assault because it was what they were willing to allow themselves to experience. That kind of logic we see a lot in treatment of victims in especially the psychedelic and spiritual communities. And perhaps that they needed to experience from some transcendent perspective, some aspect of what had happened to them there to learn a life lesson, et cetera. Or depending on, again, how you want to interpret the word medicine there, he might be trying to distinguish some mind-altering substances from others that do affect agency. But again, that distinction would still be unsupported by medical, bioethical, and legal understandings of personhood, agency, capacity, and consent.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out in the context of fast-acting vaporized or smoked tryptamines that we can leave the alcohol example aside as far as people who are non-responsive within consensus reality. Like, you can have blackout smoked vaporized tryptamine experiences. You can have experiences where you are both completely unaware of anything that's happening or completely unaware of what's happening with your physical body. And the notion that in those moments you are able to give or withdraw or even engage with the concept of consent just doesn't hold.
Yeah, if you just revisit the video from the beginning of this video of the Octavio Rettig client who's very clearly incapacitated.
Yeah, I also want to point out, like, with all the stuff in red highlighting, that this document really front loads the discourses of choice and agency. So my concern is that framing it in that way would create a sort of plausible deniability for a practitioner, where they can say, well, everything that happened here is what you chose, whether like actively or spiritually, and like a whatever dimension you want to think about it, that a person has somehow, that their agency has been involved, and that there's no way that medicine could violate that. I just think is a very bizarre, concerning framing.
Yeah, and of course we're going to get into both medicine and or drugs and the practitioner potentials for violating that. So let's continue with the document. This medicine allows for the opportunity to truly get beyond the confines of your ego. Your ego very well may interpret this as dying, and most likely this is probably the closest one can get to having a near-death experience without actually putting your physical body in immediate danger. In order to get the most from this work, it will be your job to allow this process to unfold and not to hold on to your fear, doubt, or uncertainty.
Yeah,
So
this might be a good spot to pause.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is Martin Ball insisting on the safety of an experience despite acknowledging in his LAMPS talk the very real possibility that a person could stop breathing and that could potentially lead to death. So the decision not to disclose that seems quite negligent.
Yeah, one of the reasons that this initially flagged to us as an issue was that he talks about an unresponsive client who he puts his tongue in the mouth of. And when asked about it, he told me that he has no emergency medical expertise, nor does he have emergency medical staff on hand. He told me this woman was unresponsive for around 2 minutes, which might not seem like a long time, but kind of in an emergency situation like that, especially if someone's not breathing, that can lead to like brain damage in a lot of cases or just death. Like when you, and in his response video to our reporting, he openly acknowledged that he could have given this woman CPR or chest compressions, but what felt right in the moment was putting his tongue in her mouth. And then he even goes so far in the response video as to claim that he thought the intimacy of his tongue against her tongue was what brought her back to life.
I suppose the question that sort of most people would ask her is why your tongue? Why not sort of just poke her with a finger or why choose that particular sort of method of contact?
The only answer I can give you is because that just is what felt needed to happen in that moment. Again, it's not a decision. It's
not a rush.
It's not like, well, another option is I could have tried giving her CPR, I suppose. I could have tried doing compressions on her chest. That's just what felt like, no, actually, this is all she needs. Just this very gentle touch. And it was my tongue. And, if I were to make a guess, and this is just a guess because I do not know, and I'm perfectly willing to admit that, but I think that actually it was the intimacy of the tongue to tongue that brought her back. That, here's a really intimate sensation that actually pulled her back into her awareness in her body.
But also he couldn't give her CPR, right? Because he's not actually trained. I mean, he could have given some approximation or some imagined intervention that he understood as CPR adjacent or akin. But it like making that claim is odd. And particularly when we consider the fact that he decided to lie on this woman, right? So making it more difficult for her to potentially breathe at a point where she had stopped breathing. So there's a whole bunch of really concerning things there.
And he's very much de-incentivized to get medical authorities involved because he is doing this underground. He is also high on 5-MeO-DMT with the client. So it creates a bad situation for any client who actually needs medical attention.
Yeah, like would he be in a state to administer CPR even if he did have training? There's something that I've thought about a lot since we started talking about Martin Ball is that this woman really could have died with Martin Ball lying on top of her with his tongue in her mouth. And when we asked him about his potential medical training, and he told us he didn't have any, despite having been through experiences like that. Like I think a lot of people that I know would be terrified after an experience like that. And they would have gone out and gotten themselves medical training really quickly because they would have realized that they, based on their valuing of human life, wanted to be equipped if that sort of situation were to happen again, so they could at least do everything in their power to do something. Whereas in this instance, it's like, I'm not sure if Dr. Ball feels that he did everything that was in his power, but it's a very interesting claim that intimacy with him and like the pressing of his tongue against their tongue would have somehow been a life-saving technique.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it is not a high bar to get CPR training. Like you can find CPR training classes like, you know, locally all over the country. So it wouldn't have been difficult had it been a priority for him to get that training for himself.
Yeah, and it feels worth pointing out, right, that it's not like he had to get CPR training in the wake of that. He could have also stopped practicing. I mean, I know somebody who was administering an NDMT to people who had an experience with a person who came, smoked, and then had a wild freak out experience in which it appeared that they were largely unresponsive, breathing shallowly. And I remember them saying that after that experience, they hadn't realized that that was possible. And after seeing something like that, they decided that they certainly weren't going to share that with people they didn't know, and needed to rethink what potential there was for things to go sideways. And then sort of on the other side of that, along the lines of what he's choosing to take on and then put out in the public domain at the point where he's sharing these stories and these practices and openly willing to admit that there's no need for medical training, despite recognizing this ongoing issue of people who are close to dying potentially, as he acknowledges, or people who stop breathing. Like, this seems like something, if there's a hope for a less Wild West mentality to this, you would hope people would engage more seriously.
And on top of that, to have that happen, continue practicing without medical training, and then not choose to continue not disclosing to your incoming clients the real risk of harm. And I've even heard of a situation with regular, you know, NDMT, of someone who accidentally caught their hair on fire and had convinced themselves ahead of time that if anything seemed frightening, that it was just in their head. And then it let the fire burn for a while because they were thinking to themselves, this is just in my head, this is just in my head. And here he is saying, if things appear to be going sideways, that's just your ego trying to latch on to a narrative and just relax through it. Like, that doesn't actually hold up to emergency situations.
Yeah, and that it's your job to allow this process to unfold and not hold on to fear, doubt, or uncertainty as it's happening. Those two ideas together, it really strikes me, because first he normalizes every kind of experience you could have, up to and including the belief that you are dying. Although he doesn't really say, like, you might actually die, okay? But he normalizes that. And then he introduces this notion of the client's responsibility, that it's your job as the client not to be stymied in your process by giving into any of these ego-driven things like fear or doubt or uncertainty.
It's also worth noting there was just a researcher who posted on social media the other day about having an experience, I'm forgetting what drug it was with, but falling over and cracking their head while they were under the influence, and how their mom was kind enough to drive them to the hospital, and how they thought they were having a near-death experience and didn't realize they were actually having a near-death experience. But there's this other thing before we get back to the document. I've seen a lot of pushback, including from Rob over on the Adeptus Psychedelica channel, saying that, like, oh, well, if you're advocating for medical training and CPR and all of this, then you take issue with all of these different centers and practitioners that aren't medically trained. And I don't understand that as criticism of this critique. That is to say, like, why would we start arguing for people to be less safe? Like, if you're we're not talking about friends tripping with friends in this experience. We're talking about somebody who was actively soliciting clients, somebody who
and calling what they do therapy.
Precisely.
Taking cash for it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion that there was some sort of like that there's some reason to argue against people who are taking this stuff on, like laying aside the question of should there be practitioners, there are practitioners. If people are hanging out a shingle, would we not expect and indeed demand that those people be as qualified, certified, and capable to care for the people under their care as possible? I mean, duty of care, literally.
Yeah, there are practitioners that will do things like keep around things so they can monitor heart rate or, blood oxygen levels, or like really basic medical equipment that any layperson can be trained to use as a monitoring device, so that in the event that somebody is undergoing acute distress that's manifesting physiologically, they can actually get some measurements that will tell them and their client, or patient, or whatever the setting kind of calls for, that this is within the normal realm, or that this is not within the normal realm, and that this is the decision that I'm now going to make so that your safety is protected.
And to Russell's... Sorry, no, you go ahead.
There's a parallel with midwifery and doula work where people are choosing to, give birth in their homes or wherever, but there's a, professional midwives and doulas, they have a plan for, they have those blood pressure measuring tools, and they have specifically a backup plan if these thresholds are hit, with these contraindications to trying to give birth at home. We will go to this hospital that we have a prearranged relationship with, and we will, contact this, doctor, whatever it is, that there's a backup plan. And that is standardized. That could easily happen in a situation like this, where, not just having faith that you are kind of this spiritual gift to humanity and whatever you do will be right, but to actually think through in a evidence-based way what the possible risks are and what happens when those risks are coming up.
And to Russell's earlier point, just real quick about the disincentivization of Ball to report because of the legality, because he's under the influence. I mean, we know of other practitioners where people have died because people have held off on calling in ambulances, medical professionals, whatever, out of fear of prosecution for running drug ceremonies, for being high themselves, this is not an isolated incident.
And even some of the cases that you're discussing now, I think I'm aware of some in like the underground Iboga community. Mm-hmm. And even just contrasting underground Iboga practitioners with like Ball's expertise, I know that even a lot of underground practitioners will make you get an EKG before you take Iboga and have nurses on hand, even in their underground practices. And that's not to say that all Iboga practitioners are like up to snuff, but I've heard from many who do take precautions like that before having someone take this drug with them.
Totally. So
there's a dynamic in the document I just want to point out quickly before we move on, because I think it's a dynamic that comes up in this document again and again, which is that Dr. Ball seems to be imploring his clients to trust him, trust the medicine, trust the process. Seems to frame himself at times as like omniscient or omnipotent, that he knows what's right or what to do, and that, he has the power and the ability to, save a life with his tongue or whatever. That's not in the document. That's just stuff he said. But
it was his intimacy.
His intimacy. But I think there's a pattern here where he is simultaneously claiming a lot of power and authority while at the same time disavowing responsibility for any negative consequences. Yep. So he sets himself up to make the client responsible. And if something kind of goes pear-shaped, like, oh, it's like you didn't get your ego out of the way, or you didn't this, and sort of erasing his own culpability or responsibility for anything. But if it's positive, it's because of how marvelous a practitioner he is.
Well, and I would say we see that with psychedelic authoritarians more generally, right? Where they're all maverick practitioners who can do all of this wonderful stuff. But if things go sideways, it's precisely because you're resisting and not letting them work their magic.
Well, and that's also cult dynamics in general, where you have a cult leader with spiritual gifts, where it's always, everything that goes right is because of the cult leader, and all the things that go wrong are because of the follower that wasn't sufficiently following the cult leader's recommendations.
Totally.
There's also this thing where, like, right out the gate already, this document has preemptively minimized and cast doubt on any feelings of fear or doubt or uncertainty that a client may have. And this is something that gets talked about a lot with regard to NXIVM and Keith Raniere, where people were being repeatedly kind of programmed and encouraged to put aside these different feelings that maybe indicated that it didn't feel right or that they didn't want to proceed, but they were given a framework in which those things were not to be trusted, because in this instance, like, it's presumably ego.
Well, I think that's a good point, and it actually dovetails with the next section, if we can dive in.
Yeah.
Freeing yourself from your ego is the most radically healing work you can possibly do for yourself. The more you allow yourself to open and let go, the more reward you will receive for engaging in this work. You are highly encouraged to set your intentions to fully engage with this process with the understandings that this is for you. This is your session. This is about you and your willingness to fully explore your infinite nature and take the necessary steps of personal responsibility to be yourself without projection, judgment, or attachment. Only you can do this work for yourself. The medicine is only a tool, albeit an extraordinarily powerful one. This is not—
There it is again. Can I just cut in? Yeah. There it is again. Power, power, power. And I think when we were discussing this before, Nishay made a great point about how like this language of, like, the more you allow yourself to open and let go, the more reward you'll get for engaging in this work. Like, it sounds like a pedophile saying to a child, the more you do X for me, the more toys you're going to get.
Yeah, and that's part of this whole, like, we really want to emphasize the literature and, like, the discourse around grooming in the context of this document, because it's, grooming, and Lily, you probably speak more to that specifically, but just, the idea is that there's ways of preparing people for and normalizing behaviors that, without that kind of conceptual framing, the person might be more resistant to. And so it's kind of creating a construct conceptually wherein it makes sense for certain bad behavior to unfold.
He's also being incredibly explicit, right? That anything he does, he's doing for you. So you may not recognize that this is what you need, but he's recognized it and he's doing it for you. And this is defensible because it's for you. This is not something that he wants to do. It's something he needs to do for you. And I think that dynamic becomes really insidious, particularly when we were first listening to his talk, the Lamps talk, and he's saying he touches people on the genitals sometimes because this is what they need, or he's vomiting on them because this is what they need, and the energy tells him that this is what they need, and even the voice in his head that's saying, don't do it, don't do it.
Shit, where the ego's back in there, my ego's like, dude, you can't do that. You cannot throw up on this woman. That is so rude. It's like, no, I have to. So I threw up on her head.
That's apparently that's ego telling him not to do it, and the thing that's telling him
just rationale,
right? And the thing that's telling him to do it is somehow the antithesis of ego, or the overriding of ego, which is this really weird reimagining of the internal narrative that he's experiencing, in my opinion, anyway. Do y'all want to say more on this, or go to that next paragraph?
Let's jump in.
All right. So sticking with the ego, this is not a shamanic session. This work is beyond what is provided by shamanic use of entheogens. This work is about going all the way and is not involved with prayer, ritual, other realms, entities, spirits, or any other projections of the ego. This is reality therapy. This is about encountering yourself in your immediate, infinite nature as a direct expression and embodiment of the one being that is reality. This is about you.
Can we stop there for a second?
Of course.
Just because there's a few things to say there. First of all, a lot of people point to the fact that Ball has a PhD to emphasize like his authority on these subjects and as a practitioner. But ironically here, I mean, his PhD is in religious studies, and he's saying this has nothing to do with religion. So the thing that he's supposedly an expert in, he's kind of disqualifying it as having relevance for the actual practices that he's doing. And he admits that he doesn't have any actual therapy training. So it kind of disqualifies him if you're actually paying attention to the way that he's framing it. And I'm also very interested in the way that he's always insisting to his clients not to bring any ritual elements into the session. Like, don't bring, if you have practices from home, or you have like things that you like to do when you're exploring with mind altering substances, leave it at the door. Don't bring it here. This isn't about ritual. And so there's a video of Ball on 5-MeO DMT on YouTube, and you can see there's very clear stylistic, repetitive, ritualistic elements to the way that he's moving and operating in the space. And so when he says no ritual allowed here, it's actually, to me, code for don't bring your preferred rituals into my house.
Which, you know, when we're talking about ego, you know, and we're talking about how Ball at various points seems to present himself as the egoless man, you know, the notion that for some reason the client's rituals are, you know, disallowed and only his belong in that space is an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I know he'll talk about later in this document, I believe, about the uniqueness of this process. And I've heard him say in other places that he's even had people come to him and say that with their last practitioner, it was like kindergarten, but his session their session with him was like grad school or something, in terms of kind of what he can present that other people can't. And he will say later on, I think, that like this experience is far more intense and revelatory than the shamanic use of entheogenic medicines, and is radical and direct. And it's just so interesting to me to consider that, like, why would this be any more radical or revelatory than entheogenic use in other contexts? It just doesn't make sense to me.
It's because it's him.
He's figured it out. Well, and that goes to this, the sort of saddling the clients with, you know, you want to achieve liberation through my methods, then you need to trust me and my methods. And of course, you know, you've paid to come out here, you've traveled out here. Beyond whatever offering you may give to Ball, you've also got the real world costs of getting to him and staying out there. And all of these things construct different components of this power dynamic, right? This is not a horizontal framework, despite what some might contend.
Which is a great segue to the next section in the document.
Well, here we go.
Which is interesting, by the way, that this next part of the document delves straight into cost, when like there's a lot of other logistics that
might first?
Precede it. Yeah.
Cost.
So there's.
Oh, sorry. Did you want to?
No, you go ahead.
Cost. While there is ultimately no price tag for this work, I ask for compensation on a sliding scale for a session. I'm assuming he pulled out what the range is there. Reduced rates are also available for multiple sessions. I never charge for medicine, primarily as different people need different amounts, and each session is different. I ask for compensation in recognition of my time, energy, and effort that I put into being fully present and responsive to individuals in each session. My focus is 100% on each client, and I am deeply appreciative your financial support for my services. If you are unable to contribute at the levels listed here, please feel free to discuss with me what would be more comfortable and realistic for you, and we can work something out. Payment is cash preferred, though not necessary.
I mean, the reduced rates for multiple sessions really stands out, but also this notion that like, you're not buying medicine, you're paying for me. Like, oh boy.
Well, and we've also seen that you're not paying me, you're making a donation that you feel appropriate. We've seen that with Trinity de Guzman and ayahuasca healings and this whole like, oh, it's a $2,000 donation, but you know, that's what we've decided is necessary. We're not telling you you need to pay this. It's not a, you know, this is what we humbly ask or present as reasonable in service to the medicine. Of course, never mind the fact that we're talking about incredibly potent tryptamines that may leave somebody feeling quite blissed out, in love with the universe, freely willing to give any and everything they have. I mean, you know, there's a reason on the DMT Nexus, we would encourage people to hold off 30, 60, 90 days before making any sort of significant life decisions in the wake of some of these really profound experiences.
And a lot of the language in this cash section really emphasizes how everything he's doing is done selflessly and in service with no ulterior motivation, which preemptively frames the client's interpretations of any bad behavior that comes up during the session as necessarily positive and well-intentioned. So whereas they might otherwise have concerns about something, he's framing it so that they might think to themselves, oh, this looks really bad and sketchy to me, but he must be doing it because he knows that's what I need.
Also, having heard, you know, knowing practitioners in general, knowing people who have tripped together both in some sort of professionalized, pseudo-professional sense, as well as friends, like the notion that you can 100% be there for someone when you're on drugs just doesn't hold, right? So this notion that while he's doing drugs, while they're doing drugs, that they are 100% the focus of his attention or
yeah.
You know, it doesn't hold. Regardless, we can imbue Ball with the most mystical, magical qualities that we want. And I think as a human being, there are still some of these pharmacological realities.
Yeah, that's something that has struck me in kind of trying to digest a lot of this Ball stuff, is that so much of it kind of seems to hinge on the fact that he actually claims that he is like more in touch and more acutely aware when he is on the drugs, the same drugs that his client is. And I just don't quite understand how that holds up personally. Like, I don't know, I've done a lot of mushrooms, but I still think I would be feeling mushrooms if I took mushrooms, you know, and I feel like it'd be the same with 5-MeO.
And we know that there's kind of ego amplifying effects of many psychedelics to the point where you might feel like you're enlightened and you might feel like you know exactly what the other person wants and needs in that moment. But that feeling could just be a feeling in your head that's not actually correlated with objective reality.
Yeah, or consensus reality. And the thing is, a lot of the same arguments were used. There's a 2017 Facebook thread on James Oreck's wall where you can see Octavio Rettig and his supporters making some very similar arguments to what we've seen around Martin Ball and his supporters claiming about special abilities and the ways that he shows up and this, that, and the other. So the fact that these dynamics are sort of reoccurring themes, particularly within the so-called 5 community. This is not a new issue. This is not, these are not new dynamics. These are things that kind of seem to cycle through that space with some regularity.
Because you mentioned that thread, one of the comments that stood out to me the most from that old thread, and I think the comment that Martin Ball took a lot of issue with, I think it might have been from Orrock, was that the best 5-MeO practitioner is like a nurse who can put you in an emergency position if you stop breathing or start to vomit, and anyone who gets themselves involved with the client's trip is doing something wrong, in his opinion. And I think Martin took quite an issue with that and might have called Orrock out on stage at the Exploring Psychedelics 2018 conference over that comment.
Yes, I believe he asserted wrong. Orrock was a novice in comparison to his own drug use.
Not to call anybody out, but Orrock, I'm calling you out right here, right now, because you're the guy who said this thing on Facebook. He said, anybody who involves themselves with somebody's 5-MeO DMT experience has a calcified ego and doesn't know what the fuck they're doing. And I asked Orrock, I said, really, James, have you read my book? Do you know what it is I'm presenting to people? Do you know how I actually work with people? He's like, oh yeah, it's on my list. I'll get to it. So I'm going to call him out a little bit further. James Orrock, I like him. He's a good guy. He wrote his book, Tryptamine Palace. When it comes to actual work with 5-MeO-DMT, he's a novice compared to me. And I'm just going to say that very clearly, and I'm going to repeat it one more time. He's a novice. He does not have the authority or the expertise or the knowledge to give meaningful commentary on my practices because he doesn't know.
But anyway, getting back to the session info document. So these are the session basics. Do y'all want me to just go through them all and we can talk at the end, or do you want me to break them up into?
Can we go through them one at a time?
Yeah, absolutely. So duration, approximately 2 hours, not including 45-minute to 1 hour introductory talk. This includes up to 3 to 4 rounds of medicine plus time for discussion and integration after the medicine has worn off. I will encourage you to take more medicine as soon as I see that your ego is reintegrating after the initial opening. It will be your job to trust and find the courage to take more medicine and continue with your expansion beyond the comforting confines of your ego. By the time we conclude, the medicine will have completely worn off.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to talk about in this section, just based around some of the comments he's made elsewhere. In particular, the one that is standing out to me in the beginning is that idea that he knows when your next hit needs to come, because he has specifically addressed this, talking about kind of his practice, and that when he first started giving people 5-MeO, he uses the words pushy to describe how he was about someone needing the next hit, and that if they hadn't reached the point that he thought they needed to get to energetically, then he thought it was good for them to take another hit, and he would be very, very pushy about them taking the other one. And of course, he caveats that with, if they really said no and they meant it, we would stop. But as their practitioner, I would highly encourage them to take the next hit. And whatever highly encouraged means in that scenario, he also calls it pushy. So I don't know. That seems like it's pushing boundaries to me.
And he said in, was it Entheogenic Liberation? I forget which of his books, where no's were very clearly articulated, and he was pushing the, taking more through the nose, where it wasn't just the first no that he backed off.
Well, yeah, particularly he definitely discusses this in his Exploring Psychedelics 2018 talk.
There's two occasions, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like super emphatic no's, like he's talking about, I think.
He verbalizes the no's that his clients were telling him, but then has them take more.
But I finally got some for myself. And then I gave some to my wife. And she had experienced this before. But what I found was that if I gave some to her, and if I took it at the same time as her, I could monitor what her experience was. In other words, there was nowhere for her to hide. And so for those of you, you don't need to raise your hands, but for those of you who have had 5-MeO-DMT, or if you've had toad medicine, or if you've had Yopo, you know when you go all the way, it's all one, right? Right. So I found that by taking the medicine when she took it, she might think she's gone all the way, but I could feel it's like, you're still there. I can still feel you resisting. It's like, what do you mean? Take more. No. You're right. Okay, so you take more. We would do, over an hour and a half to 2 hours, we would take repeated rounds of 5-MeO-DMT. And when I first started doing this, I was really pushy. So I would be like, as soon as I could feel that person's ego coming back in, I'd be back there. You're ready for another. No, not yet. Yes, you are. And then I decided to lay off a little bit. And then usually what I would do, I'd be holding the pipe because I could feel. And the person would sit up and that's right. You're ready for more. I've got the pipe right here. And then I got even more devious because I found that once someone is open, I didn't even need them to take more. I could do it for them. I would take a hit and all of a sudden they'd, bam, because we are one. There is only one. There's nothing magical about this.
Yeah, I found listening to that rather disturbing, personally.
And also the logic of, I can tell when your ego is starting to reform and when you need to take more. If you follow his logic throughout this, it implies that if someone, for example, starts to become uncomfortable because Ball is touching their genitals, that can be interpreted as, oh, this is their ego being in the way. Their resistance to letting that happen is a sign that they need to be pushed to take more 5-MeO-DMT. Like that is completely follows logically from the way he's presenting all of this, which is a very dangerous way to approach consent.
Well, and he talks about, sorry, Lily, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, over and again, we see him making claims that he has the authority and the omniscience to be able to determine whether or not somebody is saying no because they mean it or saying no because of some other reason, or if it's their like ego that's saying it, or if it's like a legitimate real no, in which case he's really going to listen to it. It's like, wait, hang on. Like, not only is that not how like legal frameworks work, but it's also just like not how like in the context of sexual violence work, which this is, you know, not necessarily the same thing, but to say that I just had a brain fart.
To say that no, like, so if you don't get into the question of no's meaning real no's, or trying to decipher when no means yes, you spare yourself the potential for fuck ups. Like, you know, if you don't wade into these murky waters where the only murk is you adding in the notion that there is a real no versus a fake no, you don't have to worry about whether or not a client actually wanted you to do the things that they were telling you not to do. And like along those lines, and to Lily's points about claims on authority, he explicitly says, I think it was in that 2018 Exploring Psychedelics talk, he explicitly says that he used 5 to surveil his wife, that he would dose her up and sort of use that to determine when her ego was back or when it was far out enough. And, you know, she would
use the phrasing, she couldn't hide.
Yeah, it was rather alarming. And again, back to that pushiness of, she said, no, you know, okay, I guess, fine, sure, we'll take more. Like, you know, it's, again, that murk and that real no, fake no. Bizarre.
Well, and I want to say it might have been his talk around Octavio Rettig on his podcast. I think that's where I heard it. I've been listening to a lot of his stuff, but I recently heard him say it. His understanding of the no seems less, he seems to take the verbalization of no less seriously than he takes, quote unquote, an energetic no, which he describes as kind of like a lightning bolt feeling in his arms, which he would know that like if he were touching a client and they didn't like it and he felt this energetic shock, then he would know to back off. But
then from my side of things, that energetically, when people were in a state of trust, I could feel their openness and that invitation then to work with them. And then you can also feel, at least I could also feel, when people would lose that sense of trust. And for example, if I had my hands on them, that it would actually feel like an electric shock, because there'd be like this current change within their body from one of openness and trust to fear and protection. So if ever something like that would come up, that I would immediately remove my hands from the person and sit back, because again, it's like this electric shock. I'm working on them, all of a sudden, zzz, it's like, oh, nope, this person's closed off. So then I would go and I'd sit and wait. And I'd wait for the feeling of trust and openness to then return. And of course, at any point, if a client wants to end a session, well, then that's the end of the session. So if somebody says, you know what, I think I'm done, that they're done. However, there is something very important to consider here. This is something that I talk about quite a bit in Entheogenic Liberation, that for me, there was a natural arc to the energetic progression that would take place in any given session with a client. And if a client had not reached that arc yet, I would strongly encourage that client to continue.
I don't know of any legitimate explanation for that phenomenon, and so that doesn't hold up for me personally.
Yeah, like where's the scientific literature that says that a person can determine whether or not another person is consenting or not consenting to some kind of activity on the basis of lightning bolts in their arms?
Science has not caught up with non-duality.
Oh, right. Yeah, I also think, again, like these reiterations around like you need to find the courage, and like it's just this constant overriding. Like if you have the impulse to say no, you're the one that needs to examine how much you mean that or where that comes from, or like if that's actually what's getting in the way of something else happening, you know.
Yeah,
and the odds are,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and the odds are that with a substance like 5-MeO-DMT, which like produces really like blissful positive effects for people who take it, like, yeah, they're going, like they're going to have positive reinforcement for having responded in the ways that he's telling them to, perhaps because like, I mean, I don't know what the sessions actually look like, but if there's pressure and intensity and then you submit to what he says and he backs off, if that's how it indeed shakes out, then like, there's like, you have the positive reinforcement that he backed off, and you can also just be on the drug trip now. So like, yeah, it's
so maybe it's worth
concerning.
Well, look, yeah, go ahead, Nishay.
Well, I just want to say, like with NXIVM, there's this implication that the part of you that's not okay with what's happening to you is the part of you that's stunting your growth and personal development. And so this is your unique opportunity to be able to get past that and grow into your fuller, more evolved self. And then not to, there's the whole other aspect of the energetic arc. Does that come up later?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
Let's get through the session dynamics.
Yeah.
So we have attire. Wear loose, comfortable clothing. This is not a fashion event, nor is it a ceremony. Dress in clothing that will make it easy for you to relax, allows for natural breathing, and is not constricting. Belts and jewelry are not recommended. Also, you may want to bring an extra shirt if you anticipate that you might purge or vomit during the session. About 1/5 of clients purge at some point. And please, no scents, colognes, or perfumes. I just want to point out that when he points to that shirt in the event, you anticipate that you might purge or vomit during the session. He doesn't say in anticipation that I might vomit on you during the session.
Yeah. The thing that really got me from this is like, it's one thing to make clothing recommendations based on comfort and to remind people like, hey, you may want to really have freedom of movement and looseness and comfort in your clothes. Like, no big deal. But he doesn't seem to be able to resist taking a jab at people. Like, this isn't a ceremony. This isn't a fashion show. Like that almost reminds me of like a negging dynamic, you know? It's like, can't we just leave it as a polite and caring recommendation without having to like take a jab at it if like people also maybe want to look nice?
Yeah. Shall we continue?
Yeah.
Setup. You will have a comfortable pad to lie down on, and I will have fitting music playing in the background during our session. I will be at the foot of the bed and will also be working with you directly to help move energy as it presents itself, as well as help you get out of your ego and remain open, trusting, and expanded.
Yeah, there are a couple just interesting points to note in that paragraph, in my opinion. I know we highlighted that hour session. I think that is just an interesting thing to call out, that he describes this as hour session. And yet I don't have much more to say on that really, but just the hour session. And then I know we highlighted bed here too, because that's just a weird phrase to throw in there after he describes it as a pad and then a bed.
Yeah, I just think like he can't say it's just there will be music, or like, hey, if there's music you even want to recommend, it's like, I will have fitting music.
That's the right music for you in that moment. Don't bring your own music.
And this is speculation, but he makes music. So I'm very curious if he plays his own kind of trippy music during these sessions. And I don't think it would be that crazy for him to have like CDs on hand after you're leaving, just in case you want one for yourself. But that's all speculation. I have no idea if that's actually what happened.
Considering how many times he asked us in his own questions and on his podcast questions for us about whether we'd read his books and whether if we'd gone to see practitioners to take 5. He doesn't seem to understand that people might take drugs without practitioners, but regardless, when he asked if we'd seen practitioners to take 5, if those practitioners had read his books or had been familiar with his methods or all of that. So I think the question about does he play his music is kind of interesting. So then he goes on to this afterglow section. He says, afterglow. It is common for individuals to claim that they can still feel after effects of the medicine, even though it has completely processed through the body. Your body will metabolize the medicine very quickly, and it does not produce lingering effects. Any residual effects are self-produced. We are working with a natural human neurotransmitter that you can produce in your body naturally and all on your own. It is common and perfectly normal for individuals to feel and experience similar sensation after the session when they are going to sleep or just relaxing. If such occurs, just stay relaxed and open.
Yeah, so a really important point here and a really important omission from this document is that he has a podcast where he talks with an author named Rachel Harris, where he talks at length about how he had months-long flashbacks and psychosis after a 5-MeO DMT trip.
Well, he doesn't identify it as psychosis, right? But that's just...
He doesn't. You're right. That's a really important point. But he calls it a 3-month-long trip after his 5-MeO experience. And I don't know, just to state that this couldn't happen, basically, is what this feels like the document is saying. Like, if any of this happens, it's all on your own. And I do think you metabolize the medicine quickly. I don't think he's wrong there. But he talks about how he had this months-long episode where he was kind of derealizing himself and like not in his own self.
He wasn't playing the Martin character, I think is how he says it at one point.
And Rachel Harris points out that this, for some people who are not lucky, can be really dangerous and really can screw up their life. This feeling that like this depersonalization, this derealization of who you are and like what you are in the world.
This is not something to play around with, and very, very few people. I mean, yours is the only story I've heard where this is such a good story. I am hearing numerous disaster stories where I really don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And people are not able to go through it and come out whole. But there is one little piece of it that's more within the normal range that you're describing, and that is your distance to the Martin persona. Mm-hmm. This is a really objective distance where almost from a Buddhist perspective, you're able to realize that Martin persona is constructed.
Oh, yeah.
And that's something that's very therapeutic in a controlled kind of limited way, that people report that they have a more objective view of their personality and how they constructed their personality and how their personality protects them and how it came out of their childhood experiences. But there is that objective thing where they realize, oh, I am not my personality. I am not my moods. You know, I'm not my anxiety.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly therapeutic. But that's, you know, a distant cousin from what you're describing.
Yeah. And, you know, at this point, I tend to refer to myself as like the Martin character, or I call it the Martin suit. So I say, well, you know, I put the Martin suit on and off, and,
Right.
you know, it just spontaneously comes on and off. But it definitely is an area where it would be so easy to get lost and confused, to have all this stripped away, and without the fortitude to really rest within truth, to then spin out into really difficult mental constructions and, you know, grasping. And fortunately, I made it through. I'm fine. I'm very happy with my own experience, but it definitely was extraordinary and was rather extreme.
Yes, I would say that's very extreme. And you're very lucky also. Besides your skill at navigating it and your level of acceptance, you're also lucky.
Yeah.
And here he is not only saying that that doesn't happen, but even if we look at the way that he has framed this to say any residual effects are self-produced, and that this doesn't produce lingering effects, like what does that mean in the context of smoking exogenous tryptamines? Like we know with the DMT, and it's been years since I looked at this, but my recollection is that there were peer-reviewed papers that showed that DMT produced a rush of other endogenous hormones, so like human growth hormone and other things in the wake of that. So sure, it may be that HGH and the other things that come with it are sort of self-produced as a result of taking exogenous DMT, but like you now have this neurochemical cocktail or hormonal cocktail coursing through you that would not have happened had you not taken this drug. Never mind the questions about month-long trips or psychosis or whatever might be going on there. And sort of along, I think the next section too sort of further raises questions or concerns around the way that he's presenting some of this to people. So this is dealing with bringing a friend or witness.
Can we read those two next ones with the videotaping? Because I feel like they're
absolutely,
they go together.
Bringing a friend or witness. It is fine if you want to bring a friend or companion along for your session. However, during the session, there should be no attempt at interaction between you and your companion. Such actions are always attempts by one's ego to try and maintain a sense of normality and are radically counterproductive during our work with the medicine. Videotaping. On occasion, I've been asked by clients if they can videotape their session. I am fine with this, though you must provide the camera and equipment and also agree not to share the video publicly in any way. The value of videotaping your session is that the energy of the experience and of your ego's reactions are always evident in the movements and actions of your body. It can therefore be very revealing to watch how you reacted and what kinds of energy you were working through in your session.
So these facts that people could be brought along as a companion and that the sessions were videotaped have been used again and again in attempts to discredit our reporting around this, that clearly it couldn't be abuse because people can be in the room, because people can choose to videotape it, except that the example of Larry Nassar that we mentioned in the beginning was very similar to this in the sense that because he successfully groomed people into thinking that the pelvic manipulations that he was doing were somehow medically justified, there were parents in the room for decades. He recorded aspects of his sessions that, you know, with minor children. And it turns out that that was actually not justified and that it was abusive. And it more served the cover of this is normal more than it actually was changing anything about how abusive the situation was.
Yeah, I was really alarmed too, just at like the whole section on bringing a friend or witness, because he's attempting to eliminate any help-seeking options, like kind of creating a false sense of, it seems to me like a false sense of like, well, there's somebody in the room or whatever, but like you will not, you know, it will not be acceptable for you to reach out to them and ask for help if you feel that you need it, which seems like another way of sort of breaking people away from their understanding of what's normal or what's acceptable, which makes people even more vulnerable. So he has categorically dismissed out of hand that any instances of help seeking are really coming from like a debased, egoic place and will diminish the work that he's doing, which is just like mind-bogglingly troubling. Like, I think it's important to think of like a counterexample here of somebody who's saying, you know, your empowerment through this process and your ability to articulate your needs and have those respected, you know, your ability to ask for help if you need it so that you can work through difficult things, feeling supported and safe to do so. Like there are so many other framings and alternatives to this that I think highlight just how, like, to my mind, outlandish and scary this is.
Yeah, well, and the reality of it is that he's the only one who can interact with you. That's I feel like the simplest way to like put that is that he's the only one that's allowed to interact with you during this ceremony, and you can't interact with anyone else.
And having known people who have found themselves in difficult situations within the context of ceremonial drug use, who have been there with friends, who have wanted to reach out to friends, who have wanted to go move in the circle and sit next to their friend, and the facilitator has said, no, that's not allowed, shut up, go back to where you belong. Like, I personally don't think that that adds anything beneficial, even if you want to push back and say like, well, this is what your ego needs. I mean, there are moments where perhaps it's just about making sure that that person feels well cared for in the moment, rather than pushing for some notion of growth through ego destruction or what have you.
I think too, there's this really important conflation that happens with some consistency in psychedelic spaces between ego in the psychological and Freudian sense of the ego, and ego in the sense of spiritual ideas. So like within a spiritual context, it becomes aspirational to dissolve the ego or the sense of a separate self or whatever in service to some kind of greater spiritual understanding. Whereas the ego in the psychological sense exists with the superego and the id, and is like more to do with kind of your sense of self. And so like these are two different things, and people who maybe have experienced certain types of trauma, it may be supportive to them to have their ego nourished and intact in service to like creating a more holistic and integrated sense of self and helping with things like emotion regulation. Whereas like, you know, that's different, altogether different than what people are talking about spiritually. And I think like this document from Ball does not really like indicate any delineation between those two different types of ego, and gives him license to just like, you know, explode, push past, annihilate, disintegrate a person's ego, and just kind of dismissively call things ego without recognizing that like the ego actually within a psychological framework serves a really important function.
So along those lines, I think if we move on to the symmetry, right, and that sort of control and the lack of recognition of, let's say, individuals, right? So in the symmetry section, he says, as I will discuss with you upon your arrival and prior to beginning our session, the single most important factor for you during the session will be to maintain bilateral symmetry in your body. This means no crossed legs or arms, and that the left and right sides of the body should mirror each other. Maintaining such symmetry is the most efficient way for bypassing the energetic patterns of the ego and remaining in an open, trusting, and relaxed energetic state of being.
This is when I read this, I just thought, okay, so Dr. Ball is going to control everything about this situation. He's going to control the participant. He's going to control their bodily position and posture. Anything that feels right to you that's different is going to potentially be dismissed as just your ego. So it becomes this like, you know, do what I say, lay down the way that I say you need to lay down. And then there's this implicit notion that you will be rewarded by doing the things the way that he says you need to do them.
And it gives also maximal, you know, access to your body, you know, and your genitals in cases where he has admitted to touching people there, you know, if you're open and not crossed in your arms or your legs. So it kind of facilitates whatever it is that he feels like doing.
Because you need that.
And along with just that access portion, when I initially read this paragraph, it struck me as like kind of a manifestation of potentially even his own self-consciousness. I know, like, I always heard that like crossed arms or crossed legs is kind of like denoting that you're not receiving what someone's saying, or you're not agreeing with what's being said or done. And I think that I've seen critique of kind of body language science around that too. So I don't know how true that is, but I could see him kind of thinking that, like, if your arms are crossed or your legs are crossed, what he is telling you or doing for you is not going to be received as well as he would like it to be, or something like that.
And this is, I also have a really minor point, but one that I think is worth mentioning in the way that he tries to drive home some of these different points, where it's like multiple things maybe get presented as the most important thing at various times in ways that can seem contradictory, right? So here he is saying the single most important factor for you during the session will be to maintain bilateral symmetry. And yet I suspect it may be slightly more important about how you take your hits, if you're able to hold things in, if you actually have, like, how you respond to the actual drug. Like, the way that gets reiterated with such importance raises questions in my mind about the whys of that, which I think y'all have already spoken to. Yeah. And maybe that's a good segue to get into some of his role.
Yeah. And if I could just say one last thing, please. There, it's that I understand that, like, we're working in kind of this spiritual context with him, and like he's working with a powerful drug, but could you imagine like going into a therapist office and them telling you that the most important thing for your healing was maintaining bilateral symmetry? I don't know. It just seems, that part just doesn't make much sense to me in general.
It wouldn't be my expectation either. Of course, you know, I'm sure the response to that will be, well, of course, we're unfamiliar with his non-dual energetic therapy, which again, you know, people can make up their minds around that for themselves. So he goes on to say, my role. As your facilitator, I play a highly specific role in your session. I like to describe my role as that of a reality coach and energetic mirror. As a reality coach, it is my job to keep you focused on what is actually taking place within the session. As we will be working with very powerful psychotropic substances, it is possible for confused egos to produce self-created projections and illusions. It is also possible for egos to get lost in thought during the experience. In such cases, I work to bring you back to what is actually happening within the session. This is usually done verbally. Verbalizing can be a way of creating distance between the self and the experience, however. So our goal is always to keep verbalizing and conversation to a minimum. There will be ample time to discuss your experience at the conclusion of the session. During the session, it is best to stay focused on the experience itself and leave verbalizing for a later time. However, if you need verbal coaching during the session, I will provide it. Maybe we stop there.
So maybe we should pause here. Yeah. My first thought in this paragraph is he refers to himself as a reality coach. Earlier in the document, he referred to this as reality therapy. So in this context, he's your reality coach, he's your reality therapist, and yet he actually has no certifications or training in anything therapeutic or reality. I don't even know what would constitute certification to be a reality coach. But that struck me initially.
I think that the baseline qualification of that is having like the willingness to appoint yourself as the arbiter of reality.
Yeah.
Like I would, like all of these claims strike me as so egotistical. And at the same time, undermining the legitimacy of like any experience that a client might have that differs from his. Mm-hmm. You know, he talks later about like, you know, some of the confusion that may happen in this space. And it's like, So if you get confused and misread what he is doing and knows to be reality, then that's on you for misreading and misexperiencing the situation.
There's also, I think, a worthwhile analogy. So Nishay has brought up cave diving, or sorry, scuba in I think both maybe actually in relation to like psychedelics and familiarity and sort of having the experiential understanding of what comes with the terrain. And, you know, we can take it further, like through the Nexus, I met a number of people who were into adrenaline sports, who were into squirrel suit, base jumping, skydiving, you know, all of this. And they've been doing it for years and were incredibly, they were experts, right? And yet even within that cohort, they had people, they had friends who died. They had friends who had malfunctions and who were, you know, had traumatic brain injuries. And I mean, some of their kids had injuries as a result of other extreme sports, where again, like these were, one of them would lead mountain rescues and still ended up dying as a result of being out in extreme conditions and an avalanche. And so shit happens, right? Whether we're talking about, you know, extreme sports or psychedelics. And looking at this notion where he's acknowledging that confused egos can produce self-created projections and illusions, that it's possible for egos to get lost in thought, like even the most experienced psychonauts have experiences that can be challenging, whether they decide to make meaning of that by saying, I had a 3-month DMT trip or 5 trip, which always, I always feel like I kind of freeze in trying to respond to some of those articulations, or whether they have a single experience where in that moment they lose coordination, sense of self, ability to relate to others, right? The notion that this confusion will only be on the client, particularly when we're talking about somebody who has acknowledged taking drugs with his clients, when people have publicly shared about sessions where he has taken more drugs than they have, like the notion that he is somehow immune from that potential for confusion doesn't hold to my mind, and is something that I think is important to flag and say, well, then how can all of these sort of supposedly ironclad statements about never having done this or always knowing what people need, how can those hold in that context?
Yep.
Another important, I think, thing to touch on from that paragraph was this idea of verbalizing, because he is very like heavily discourages the client from verbalizing and says, we'll do it if we really need to, but keep it to a minimum. And that just struck me as bizarre because I watched the original video from our reporting. He often will have his tongue on clients' foreheads and be like making these crazy noises, and these interpretations of the energy, I think he would call it. But
no, it is the sound the energy makes. There's no interpretation. It's,
yes,
you know.
So yeah, but he's allowed to verbalize throughout this whole thing in whatever way he wants to, but for some reason he discourages the client from doing anything like that.
Or in the case of the Jewish client, where he sat on their chest and yelled at them, right? Like, or spoke very intensely. Sorry, Nishay, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I forgot what I was just like.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
We can move on to the mirror section.
Oh wait, I remember.
Yeah, go.
Sorry.
Go. No, that's perfect.
Yeah. So just not to mention, like, just on the energetic thing and kind of like the sounds and just how intense they are, even in the versions he has shared publicly, it can be really intimidating to try to intervene in that kind of a performance and say, hey, like, I'm kind of uncomfortable with the way that you're touching me, you know, like that. There's all of these barriers to actually being able to get a word in, let alone leaving it to him to decide whether that verbalization is one of these necessary, you know, moments or should be repressed and kind of pushed through.
Totally.
Also, just the claim that, like, if any talking is necessary in this space, I will do it. Like, what?
I mean, that's like one thing I just want to flag, like, as we're going to be wrapping up, like, and through this document, is there's all of these confident claims that his supporters point to as justifications when actually the pattern here is highly egotistical, not evidence-based claims. And so it's actually on him to prove that he has these, special qualifications. And we
100%.
have not seen any evidence that that is the case. So in the absence of evidence, given the patterns, it seems far more likely that he has fallen into a very high assessment of his own abilities at the expense of what's actually best and useful to his clients.
Well,
one might even say fallen into a trap of his own ego.
Perhaps he'll provide some evidence as we close out this document. So he goes on in the his role section to state, my role as an energetic mirror is a bit different. Significantly, I will be taking medicine with you. This allows me to monitor your ego at a very subtle level. I can clearly experience it when your ego has gotten out of the way and you are in a place of openness and trust. When this occurs, I can then use my body to help you move, process, and release stored or blocked energy. This usually involves me placing my hands on your body, which might be anywhere along the central line of your body, from the top of your head to your pubic area, using my breath, voice, and body to move energy, and working with you directly as one unified energetic field. When your ego drops, there will be no real distinction between us. As soon as your ego starts to reform, I will feel it. At that point, we can go for more medicine and continue to process your energy. I can only help you process energy when your ego is relaxed, open, and trusting. There is nothing I can do for a resisting ego other than serve as a reality coach and give encouragement and clarity through conversation. Do you want me to continue or take that chunk?
Let's pause there. Yeah. Like the notion that like, if you're resisting, there's nothing I can do for you. I just find that very frightening, because it reinforces everything and like that he said about, you need to trust and let go and surrender, and there will be these great rewards. And here he's kind of is the stick. There's the carrot, there's the stick. And this is the like, if you can't get past those things, well, you're beyond where I can help you. It's very all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And people refer to this, the mention of the central line of the body from the top of your head to your pubic area. People cite this reference as the consent, that people know that they're going to have their genitals touched during the experience. And that's actually not clear here. The word pubic area is very like medicalized and distanced, and people might not really assume that their genitals are going to be fondled. Like that doesn't necessarily follow from that specific wording.
Well, and but just to be clear, Ball would contest and say he's not fondling anyone. I'm not saying here nor there, like obviously none of us has been there, we don't know. But even if it's not fondling, like there's not clear indication there that somebody is going to touch, poke, grab, whatever. Like the point of the medicalized language and the way that it's just sort of there as a throwaway line. I mean, it's absolutely worth flagging.
The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the pubic area as of, relating to, or situated in or near the region of the pubes or pubis. So like I actually read that as like above the genitals, like kind of between like where the hip bones jut out. So it's like that really low belly part, which isn't a place I'd want to be touched under the influence anyway, but that is distinct from genitals.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to the point, when he told people to bring a shirt in the case that they might purge, right? He also didn't include that I might purge on you, right? Like we are not getting the sort of explicit claims. And I'm sure the assertion might be that, oh, well, it's not in the document, but I tell them in the talk. We have no way of vetting that. We do know of at least one person who didn't get the document. So Ball is not necessarily a reliable narrator. In fact, we've found numerous contradictions in the relatively short period of time we've been engaging with this.
Well, and the talk happens and correct me if I'm wrong, but the talk that I've heard described is when people are actually there and
Yep.
it's like a prep talk.
Yep.
That's not the place to say you might want to pack a t-shirt. The people have already traveled in some cases from out of state, you know, I don't know if out of the country, but definitely from far away in some cases. And so the fact that he didn't mention it, that he might purge on you during that shirt throwaway line, given that in his published books, he mentions the fact that purging on people is sometimes something that happens. It's really striking that he omitted that.
And a practice he promotes for others to emulate, right? So similarly, I think you're pointing out his vagueness around, you know, the pubic area. Similarly, like when somebody shows up to say, hey, I might touch your genitals if that's what you need. Again, not the time or place, particularly like if they haven't been made aware of that ahead of time, they've already invested whatever money. Like the notion that there's some sort of consent freely given at that point neglects all of the power and economic dynamics that are already in play.
It also, this point might not make any sense. I didn't write it down or anything, but he has this thing called the entheological paradigm, which he kind of claims is like this universal explanation for everything and the ultimate way to end up finding happiness. And he encourages clients to read his work on this and do that. So by the time they're getting this talk, they might have already convinced themselves that his understanding of the universe is the only way to truly find happiness as well.
Is that the paradigm that says that there's no room for moral or ethical systems?
Yeah, that's the one. It says that he has a large list of spiritual and religious beliefs that are incompatible with the entheological paradigm, and on that list is moral and ethical systems.
Well, so before we drift too far from the document, let's just get back to how he rounds out the his role section, which closes with him stating, "This process is completely unique. This is far more intense and revelatory than the shamanic use of entheogenic medicines and is radical and direct. I do not personally know of any other practitioners who can provide the same kind of clear guidance and energetic mirroring as myself. Even individuals who have experienced the same medicine that I use cannot believe how much more powerful a session using this methodology is."
And again, it's kind of dangling this carrot of like, if you really want this once in a lifetime chance to have this, you know, massive experience, life-changing experience, you need to commit to whatever it is that he wants to happen in the session. And that's a lot of pressure to put on people in these kind of like vulnerable states that like, if anything comes up, they just need to push through it or they will miss their opportunity to actually grow.
Yeah, also like that paragraph just reads as so self-aggrandizing and egotistical. Like it's mind-boggling.
It's while trying to kind of hide that a bit, like I do not personally know of anyone more powerful than myself. It's like, it sort of indicates like he would cite someone if he had come across someone. So just objectively, there's no one out there that he's encountered, you know, it's this like faux humility that's actually, you know, self-aggrandized.
Yeah, and in the context of his statements about James Orrick and looking at some of the history of let's say some of the distribution of 5 in the US or in industrial context, like to just come out and proclaim him as a novice is kind of telling, right? Like it indicates some of that aggrandizement going on. And now the document moves into some slightly different territory. I was thinking for this section, I'll just go, there's 4 paragraphs, so I'll just do 2 and 2. So this is the processing energy section. All medicines alter your ability to perceive, experience, and process energy in your body, mind, and being. We will be working with the world's most powerful energetic opener. This is a radical experience and most likely will be experienced by you as a massive and infinite flood of energy coursing through your being. Egos are collections of energetic patterns, thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors and reactions. It is impossible for an individual to go all the way into their infinite energetic nature and retain their ego's energetic constructs. It is only through dropping these energetic constructs that an individual can experience his or her full infinite nature. I can do the next two as well, and we can do them all together.
I just think, like, I do want to say about this that, like, he continues to say things that really suggest that, you know, don't let your ego get in the way of the work, and, you know, prove yourself to me that you can be a person who can fully experience this, you know, intense method and get the best benefit and, like, go all the way. And I just, again, like, functionally that encourages people to put aside their feelings that, like, there may be danger here, or they're not comfortable with what's happening, or they're scared. And he also, like, his use of the ego could, like, the word ego could be replaced with, like, self or humanity. But, like, he always seems to use ego as, like, a negative thing.
Yeah. All right, so the next two paragraphs of this section. When egos drop, it then becomes possible to process energy much more efficiently and productively in the body. Egos, through holdings produced by patterns of thought, belief, and action, store energetic patterns in the body in the form of resistance, fear, or constricted energy. When ego gets out of the way, it becomes possible to release, transform, and move this constricted energy. It is constricted energy that is the cause of personal suffering, illness, disease, and other personal problems and discomforts. A primary goal of this work is to allow all your energy to flow freely and without the constrictions imposed by your ego. This is primarily a process of learning to allow yourself to be yourself fully without the limitations of your ego. Large energetic releases are very common with this work. This will look different for different individuals, depending on how each individual has used his or her ego to create blocks and restrictions. People who are usually very quiet and withhold their free expression, for example, may need to scream and shout at top volume. People who hold on through fear might need to purge and vomit out all that constrictive energy. Others may need to laugh until they cry. Each person's release is unique and an individual expression of his or her authentic energy. Our only goal is for authentic expression and release of energy. There is no uniform right or wrong here.
It's kind of using a scientific way of saying, you know, whatever your normal boundaries and preferences are, you need to do the opposite and don't do what usually makes you comfortable. Do the opposite as a way of getting you into this, like, transcendental state, which is just very convenient, you know, when you're going to be, in some cases, touching people in their genitals, to kind of frame it as what the thing that they need to let happen.
Yeah, and Nishay, I think earlier in the discussion, you had mentioned how this logic suggests that if if a patient or client is experiencing some concern, like that they don't want to be fondled, they're encouraged to see that as a reflection of their restricted ego nature instead of something that should be taken seriously and acted on, which I thought was a really good point.
There's also some of this neoliberal framing around, like, personal problems, right? This notion that, like, constricted energy is the cause of personal suffering, illness, disease. It's like, yeah, sure, go to Flint, Michigan and tell the people that it's their constricted energy that's the reason that, like, they're dealing with the fallout of lead poisoning or what have you, like that just, I'm sorry, it's bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't hold up.
I mean, we've gone over the issues with ego throughout. I'm pretty good. Unless y'all want to bang on a bit more about that, we can jump into the next section, which deals with sessions, and I think really gives a good opportunity to explore some of the power dynamics around people who are offering these experiences. And I think it's worth noting too that in a talk, I think it was the 2018 Exploring Psychedelics talk, Ball notes that he had difficulty sourcing 5, had been going through someone who was in the audience until he got his own source. So even for the people who are putting themselves out there, perhaps those unfamiliar with the dark web or those without, connections to psychedelic dealers or whatever, that there are like actual power dynamics around obtaining these drugs and the experiences they facilitate. And that needs to be remembered, right? Particularly when we're talking about newer folks, people who are first seeking out these experiences, the type of people who are, in my opinion, more likely to seek out a practitioner. They tend to do so because that is the easiest way for them to access the drug and the experience. And so when we talk about session dynamics, we need to remember that this person may just simply be the most accessible, easily identifiable outlet or source of the drug and experience.
Yeah, and as we get into this this section too, I think it's important to note that in our initial reporting, when asked about some of these clients who either had their genitals touched or were puked on or were unresponsive and had a tongue put in their mouth, one of the kind of consistent things we were told back from Martin was that a lot of these patients came back for more, came back for another session and experience. And I think this next part of the document kind of fleshes out what the reality of that might have looked like, or what the reality of multiple sessions with him might have looked like in some scenarios, and why that statement or the justification for that justification is a little questionable, in my opinion.
Totally. So here's the multiple sessions section. Many individuals who travel for this work are interested in having multiple sessions in order to maximize their visit. If you feel up for it, I highly encourage you to consider this option. For multiple sessions, I like to give clients the opportunity to experience different medicines in order to become familiar with the many spectrums of their authentic energy. Generally, I recommend 1 day off between sessions for integration and reflection. Keep in mind that this work is radical and can be very demanding and challenging, as well as profoundly rewarding and transformative. Most people come away with the understanding that whatever it has been that they have been looking for in their lives, this is it. I am available for sessions on most days with a flexible schedule. Generally, we arrange sessions for either 2 p.m. in the afternoon or 7 p.m. in the evening, depending on availability. I recommend that you arrange a session as far in advance as possible, as at times I am under high demand for my services. If you need to cancel or reschedule, that is fine.
I think this whole marketing multiple sessions, I find it suspect of well, you came all the way here, you might as well do as many drugs as possible with me. It makes people increasingly suggestible, but I think it also goes to the point of the sunk cost fallacy. So people travel the distance, they make the investment, they put in work and time and effort to try and get the best benefit that they can. So, people do come back for more, it seems, but there's a lot of factors going into why they may be doing that.
Yeah. And why it's questionable for me too is that the justification that all of what he did was okay because people came back for more. I don't know what every client situation was, but to me, if you came back 3 times in the span of a week versus you had multiple sessions with him over a multi-year relationship, that paints a very different picture to me. And I can't speak to any of his clients' experiences, but at least from this document, to me, it hints that you're doing multiple sessions in a fairly short period of time. Also back to the access question, or the access point that you had made, Dave, he's offering multiple drugs that a lot of people might not know how to access or have access to. I know he's offered salvia, NN-DMT, and 5-MeO-DMT to clients. And those are drugs that I wouldn't necessarily know how to find just in my hometown necessarily. So it does speak to that point of access, and that he's kind of being a gatekeeper to these people as well.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out in the context of people coming back, like I've spoken to a client who has said that they had a mostly positive experience and mostly positive experiences with Ball. However, they were not comfortable with Ball, engaging in certain behaviors that they felt uncomfortable about it at the time. In retrospect, they've continued to feel uncomfortable about it. In context of the recent discussions that have gone on, they have felt they have been attacked when they have sort of raised certain questions, and have then since then said, well, why would I come forward with more of these questions, even at the point where I'm saying I had mostly favorable experiences, and I just want to point out that there are things that need to be addressed that made me uncomfortable. Like, where the discourse is sitting at the moment, and the sort of defensiveness around protect Ball or protecting Ball, like it's not conducive to actually starting to unpack the questions around, well, gee, like how much time did you have to consider whether or not you wanted to go back? How much time did you have to integrate? I can tell you, based on my own sitting with certain substances, right? Like, it took months in some cases to realize that I had been encountering certain phenomenological components of those experiences, like thinking about, for example, an NDMT, where I saw entities. I had thought that I hadn't been seeing entities for ages. Fast forward to an experience where suddenly I saw some and had this cascade of memories of some of them being in prior experiences. And that sort of encounter that's not an isolated event, right? Like, you can look through experience reports and you can see that there are other people who find that they have recollections of prior experiences as they're engaged in a current or new experience. And so the way that some of these discourses are being used to say, oh, nobody's saying the things that we would expect somebody to say in precisely the way that we're demanding it, so everything's fine here, like, that doesn't actually hold, and that's not what's actually been said publicly around this. Sorry, Lily, it looked like you maybe wanted to say something. Not to put you on the spot.
I don't know that I have much else to say about this. Like,
can we also just point out that the framework of most people come away saying that whatever it has been that they've been looking for in their lives, this is it? Like, okay, I relate to that. I understand that experience. I know that experience. And like, the amount of things that I have pushed aside in some of my own experiences in order to have that experience, in order to have that little taste of this is it, in order to experience the ineffable or the divine, or, unitive Godhead-like states. Like, okay, the things that come along with that, when you're exchanging in that level of currency, people are willing to pay the price for that, and people are willing to pay significant prices for that. And I think we've all seen that personally. I think we've seen that play out throughout these spaces, in a cyclical way. None of this is new.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that James Orak pointed out in one of the posts from that earlier period, that when you're dealing at that level of kind of like existential, spiritual meaning making, and then you have an experience that isn't fantastic, it can be really disruptive, which we've touched on before. But it's like, when there's something that happens, there's no one you can just like casually call and say like, oh, like, did I fuck up on this cosmic level and ruin everything for myself? Like that there isn't really like a way to easily process that kind of an experience when it feels that way. And so, and Orak was saying that like he ended up fielding calls from people who had come from a practitioner and were desperate and struggling. And so it isn't something that he leaves a lot of room for care around.
All right. Well, then getting back to the document.
We're going to skip over traveling and lodging, but I just wanted to mention that it adds to the grooming effect of the document in the sense that it's like nothing to see here, just a bit of fine print and local pizzerias, and it really adds to the kind of routinization of the process. So just wanted to mention that quickly.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So then he goes into the contraindicators section. Anyone who is currently taking pharmaceutical medications or anyone who has severe health, particularly heart issues, should not undertake this work. Many psychiatric medications, antidepressants, tranquilizers, antipsychotics can react to tryptamines in unpredictable ways and could be dangerous. Additionally, alcohol interferes with the medicine and with the work. Clients should refrain from consuming alcohol for at least 24 hours prior to session. Even better is to not consume any alcohol at all, as it is primarily a poison and ego intoxicant.
That's like not the worst advice in the world, but he just like Lily, like you said earlier, it's like he can't resist taking that jab about like alcohol's a poison and an ego intoxicant.
Yeah, it's also like, come on, man. Like, by all accounts, it seems 5-MeO-DMT may also be a bit of an ego intoxicant. Like, I don't know. I think like policing or, you know, trying to make rules and advice about what substances people should or shouldn't use or how they should use them. Just like, I mean, it just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah. Also, sorry, go ahead.
I would say the contraindications, like the way that it's framed, could, along with his earlier point about how 5 isn't dangerous, could lead him to imply that any dangerous outcome, like, you know, cessation of breathing or whatever else, is the result of some undisclosed contraindication that's the client's fault and not something he has to take responsibility for.
Yeah, and he's gone with this vague, broad sort of notion of like, okay, I'm giving you enough of a red flag to say that if you're taking any sort of pharmaceuticals or if you have any severe health issues, you know, never mind what that's being defined as beyond like heart issues. You know, now you know that you need to inform yourself. Like, I'm not giving you a list. I'm not giving you rundowns of types. Like, I'm just saying most, you know, if you realize that you have something now, that information is on you to suss out. And I want to say, as someone having spent not inconsiderable time in some of these spaces, some of the knowledge and insight that you accumulate and accrue over your time in these spaces is fundamentally different from what's actually accessible. Like, I had somebody recently asking me about doses for dose ranges for Harmine and Harmaline. And I realized like I had a pretty coherent understanding of my own sort of relationship with that. But in trying to go through Psychonaut Wiki, DMT Nexus, Erowid, everywhere, like the specificity that I had accrued from, you know, a decade plus of using those compounds simply wasn't there. Nobody had written down dose information the way that if you go to mescaline on Erowid, you'll see a discussion of the different salts and their weights and the dose range for light, moderate, heavy, you know, whatever. And so when we're talking about some of this, there is something to be said for a practitioner who's placing themselves in a position of authority to be very clear, or at least the clearest and most detailed, specific that they can be, to then invite further engagement along those lines, rather than offloading that onto a client to say, well, you know, you didn't do your homework, and as Nishay said, and because you've now stopped breathing, well, I'm going to put this on there being some unknown other issue that you just didn't address.
Just real quick, along the lines of like the sunk cost issue, is that like a lot of times people will read something like this, commit to going, and then get off all of their pharmaceuticals in order to have this experience, and sometimes at great like struggle to persevere through that transition period. So it adds to the kind of, you've done all this prep, and so it encourages people to go through whatever it is that meets them at the other side.
Yeah, and on that note too, there was a recent study, I think it was dealing with I want to say it was MDMA. Sorry, I'm probably gonna botch this, but it showed like lower efficacy in close proximity to certain antidepressant regimens, and that like even if you've just recently cut all your antidepressants, right, in order to go enroll in like an MDMA therapy session or trial, whatever, that you're not necessarily going to see the results that you hoped for. And so if we're talking about this particularly in the context of underground so-called therapy, right, the notion of people stopping their meds, hoping for profound effects and potentially not getting what they were looking for, but also now being off of their meds, like there are so many considerations around that and so many dynamics. And, you know, as Ball is going on about how each individual is unique in their energies and this, that, and the other, it's like, yeah, and each person is also unique in their actual neuropharmacology and where they're at and what their needs are, and to not engage with that as a, you know, practitioner, underground, above ground, whatever, you know, that's a problem to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it would be so different if a sheet like this said something like, please inform me as your practitioner of any medications you may be on, so we can have a candid discussion about, you know, what's going to make sense and what's going to be safe.
So yeah, just to sort of bring this home, the last section of the document is entitled, or it's not in, it's how to prepare. And it reads, I'm often asked, what can I do to prepare myself for this work? The best answer is get into the practice of being honest with yourself and others at all times. Don't be afraid to be honest, express yourself and say what you really mean and mean what you say and do. This is the best preparation, as this is a process of coming to terms with reality, free from projection, illusion, attachment, or egoic concepts. Practicing honesty is the best way to familiarize yourself with genuine energy. Additionally, I highly recommend that you read my book, Being Human, an entheological guide to God, evolution, and the fractal energetic nature of reality prior to our session. Being Human is available at my website, www.martinball.net, and at amazon.com. There is also relevant reading material at my webpage, www.entheologicalparadigm.net. I look forward to working with you. Martin.
Just real quick, all the language like hyping authenticity and honesty, it really frames Ball as being precisely such an honest, authentic being who only ever says what he means and means what he says. And so it discourages people from interpreting like maybe this person doesn't have my best intent, my well-being at heart. Maybe they're not super trustworthy. It frames it in such a way that is less likely an interpretation.
Yeah, and a point from there that I just found particularly confusing or kind of contradictory of one another is him saying, mean what you say and do, be honest with yourself. But then throughout this whole document, he's also been telling you that this experience is about letting go of projection, illusion, attachment, egoic concepts. And the way that he frames that idea, those egoic concepts, I feel like could be contextualized as being honest with yourself based on past experiences and like maybe fears that you have, potentially rightly so. I don't know, that all just felt a little contradictory to me.
Well, also, if you look at the pushback that we've gotten for trying to talk about these issues, right, where we saw issues from the original Lamps talk, we presented those words and people said, oh, well, this has been taken out of context, right? That these words don't mean what they're saying. And the notion that, right, that here we are somehow engaging in bad faith rather than a notion that this could be us honestly expressing ourselves, that we're saying what we mean what we're saying, and that we see issues here and want public engagement with this from these communities precisely because these sorts of issues have lingered for so long, precisely because looking specifically at like the 5 space or 5 communities or whatever you want to call it, like there's been a notion of sort of cowboys, rogue practitioners, poor health and safety practices. Like people have known in these spaces that like these issues have been present there in ways that I think feel comparatively more significant and more egregious than in psychedelic communities writ large. And so it's like, it's fascinating to see the pushback, particularly from people who have gone so long with these issues being highly publicized, but not particularly scrutinized. And so again, in that context, that conclusion has some weird feelings for me as well.
Yeah, I mean, as we wrap this, I feel like I want to sort of speak again to like why we're doing this. Like, obviously we've put a bit of time into reading and analyzing this document and creating this video, and like Martin Ball is kind of a side note. Like, this is a really important example of something that is happening, and he is by no means the only person acting in these ways. And so like, we do think of this as a form of ideological harm reduction and trying to offer some analysis and engagement with the ideas that have been put on the page here, and what we think is actually dangerous about those ideas, and what can be the dangerous consequences of those ideas, how they set up certain types of experiences to be seen as normal and permissible, and how that can really get into people's heads, especially when they're suggestible and in altered states, in really harmful ways. It can undermine their analysis and assessment of things that have happened to them in their own experience. And it gives a lot of pass cards to people who may be acting in harmful ways. So like, I don't know what exactly happens in a session with Dr. Martin Ball, and I hope to never find out, not firsthand anyway. And that's because I have read this document closely and like found a whole lot of red flags that to me indicate that I could come away from an experience like this having been very deeply harmed, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, physically, or dead. So yeah, I just think that like this stuff matters, and the tactics that are on display in this writing are insidious, and complex and subtle and nuanced, and merit actually engaging with and pulling apart, not to hurt anybody, but to be really clear about dynamics and ways of thinking that I'm concerned could hurt people.
And at this time in particular, it's really important to be having this conversation as psychedelics are mainstreaming, and a lot of novice people, psychedelic naive people, are suddenly gaining interest in having these types of experiences, and then coming across self-identified practitioners like Martin Ball and people like Martin Ball who have existed in an underground context until now, trying to seek some of the attention and celebrity that comes from this new kind of shift in public awareness around these topics. So I think, as an organization, Symposia is really trying to resist further acceleration of these trends, like into the community and into the mainstream as that process is unfolding.
Well, and you've talked a bit, Nishay, about the way that this document functions as a potentially as a grooming document, right? And the sort of normalization of these dynamics, the normalization of this language in these unexamined ways. I mean, I don't know if there's a sort of conclusion point you wanted to put on that around like Nasser and the others and the way that this functions. I mean, I have some thoughts around that in regards to like psychedelic authoritarianism, but I wanted to just like bring up, because you've been so instrumental in that sort of grooming critique. Before I said anything, I wanted to see if you had final thoughts on that, or.
Yeah, well, you can go ahead first, and then if
yeah, totally.
I feel like right.
So for me, like when I look at this, like I find that the framework of psychedelic authoritarianism, stretching back at least as far as MK Ultra and some of its sort of temporally coexisting programs. It's important to understand both in like the mechanisms, right? In like looking at Ewan Cameron's sort of psychic driving and the use of loud music and stroboscopic lights and, video techniques and all of this stuff. Like those are the dynamics that really catch people's eye, right? The things that are currently being used, say at like Guantanamo or other US black sites, where it's like, okay, that's like the psychedelic shit show and torture. And we understand why people might take issue with that. But there's a subtler aspect around this where it situates power with the therapist or the practitioner, where all of the things that we've been talking about through this this video, through some of our past writings, where the therapist knows what's best, the therapist knows what the client needs, where even though this hurts, it's coming from a place of love or care. We're pushing you through the boundaries. We're pushing you to the edge of consent. We're pushing you past consent, but it's so that you heal. We know how to put you back together. The notion that like your sense of what's happening isn't really accurate, which is why you need to trust us. And so when you start looking at the dynamics that are there, and you start looking through like the historical literature, you see that like these ideas exist in a number of schools of thought throughout psychedelia. And I think this particular case of Ball was so striking, both because he's there in his own words sharing some of it, and then he then shared this document with us that then evidenced a whole bunch more of these dynamics. And I think it's important to say something to highlight these more subtle dynamics and the things that get less explored, particularly as people get excited that drug using cultures and subcultures are getting attention, and say, hey, like the things that have been done for a long time and normalized are actually not okay, and we need to be willing and able to have these conversations about these dynamics publicly.
And that's, if I could just do a quick connection back to Nassar from that, because there's a great New York Magazine piece about how Nassar got away for so long with what he was doing. And it was striking that at first, most people who heard that he was arrested were confused, because they were like, what, what, like that happened to me, that wasn't bad. And they actually like stood up for him and thought that it was okay. And it's only because they found this hard drive, the police found this hard drive because he tried to throw it out and the trash was late that day, that had all of his collection of minor material that was, incontrovertible and damning about the fact that he was a predator, that this all finally came out. And so the fact that people are telling us, I don't care about your red flags, if people are okay with this, like there's no issue here, doesn't really check out, that it's just a reflection of how successful the grooming has been. And as long as we are creating these containers where people can act in authoritarian ways, we are inviting people who literally get off on power plays and subjecting people to these kinds of torture and abuse, to find people in these contexts and to cultivate a situation for themselves socially where they have free rotating door access to people that they can manipulate and feed off of in narcissistic ways. And so that, regardless of any one person's motivations for being a practitioner, if we're being conducive to these kinds of ideologies, we are literally holding the door open for people to come in and engage with vulnerable people in that way.
Yeah, and just as a cherry on top of that phenomenal point, like Keith Raniere has supporters protesting outside of his jail cell still. Like, just because people are willing to support someone doesn't actually offer a real clear sense of what they have or haven't done.
Yeah, I think like one of the things that's crossed my mind a few times in the last few minutes of this discussion is like, people who are interested in experiencing psychedelics can and should expect more than this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it. Thanks for tuning in.
And thanks to all of you. I know this has been really emotionally taxing, especially just with all the blowback, but I think, it's been helpful for me also to work through this document with y'all, and thanks to everyone listening as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
See y'all next time.